live stream starts. My name is Kim Igwe, and I'm the Professional Learning Manager here at Branch Ed. As we wait for the LinkedIn live streaming to start, we just want to welcome you and thank you for coming today. Today's webinar is Ready Day 1, the intersection of content, pedagogy, and the learner, hosted by Branch Alliance for Educator Diversity, or Branch Ed. Welcome. Branch Alliance for Educator Diversity is a professional services organization and a collective of university faculty and leaders advancing educational equity and excellence by expanding individual capacity, enabling supportive relationships, boosting institutional effectiveness, and collaborating with communities. Branch Ed's commitment is to achieve sustainable programmatic transformation leading to improved outcomes for diverse educators who, by extension, benefit all students by preparing them to thrive in our heterogeneous society. Branch Ed offers a variety of professional learning experiences and resources for individuals, institutions, and community members. Through each of these professional learning experiences, our beliefs hold true that every student deserves access to caring, adaptive, and well-prepared teachers. Every teacher deserves preparation that fuses quality with diversity, and every person benefits when we create a higher standard of education together. A little bit about housekeeping. This webinar will be recorded and available in a follow-up email. It will also be available on Branch Ed's resource portal. We are live streaming this webinar on LinkedIn. Thanks for those who are joining there. Resources and links will be shared in the chat feature in Zoom. Please use that feature to notify the Branch Ed team of any technical difficulties. Thank you, Branch Ed team. And submit any questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A feature. Today is the 7th webinar in our 2022-2023 webinar series. The purpose of this series is to highlight the application of Branch Ed's signature framework for the quality preparation of educators, which outlines a roadmap to create teacher preparation programs that meet the needs of our increasingly diverse student body. It seeks to build equity-oriented educator preparation programs, that prepare educators to reflect and respect the value of the diversity of America's pre-K through 12 school children. The framework identifies 6 critical principles that teacher preparation providers can leverage to redesign their programs. 2 of these principles, community of learners and data empowerment, provide the foundation for the remaining principles: equitable experiences, inclusive pedagogy, intersectional content, and practice-based approach. Today's webinar is focused on intersectional content. We believe quality educator preparation is grounded in intersectional content, where teacher candidates and graduates demonstrate mastery of content related to learners, learning, subject matter, content knowledge for teaching, pedagogical knowledge, assessment, and engagement with families. Our speaker today is Dr. Jerell Hill. Dr. Hill is Dean of the School of Human Development and Education at Pacific Oaks College with over 20 years of service as an educator. He's a dynamic scholar practitioner who is a voice for educational justice and diversity, equity, and inclusion. His primary research includes educator diversity, identity, leadership, and academic achievement. He is proud to have taught within many diverse populations and in various urban educational contexts. He also serves as a keynote speaker and a workshop facilitator at global and national conferences. Thank you, Dr. Hill, for being here today to share about what Pacific Oaks is doing.
Thank you, Kim, for that wonderful introduction. I'm just really always thrilled to be a part of the Branch Ed family and supports that Branch Ed has given me throughout my career. I'm really excited to share some of the work that we're doing here at Pacific Oaks. The first thing I'd like to do is I'd like to really start off with the land acknowledgement as we're situated in Pasadena. We acknowledge the land where we are today is the home and the traditional land belonging to the Tongva Nation. Today we come with respect and gratitude for the Tongva people who still consider themselves the caretakers of this land. Through their examples, we are reminded of our greater responsibility to take care of the earth and each other. So again, I always like to have that space acknowledgement in the space before we get started. I want to situate the work in the social justice context. Again, diversity, inclusion, and respect, some of our core values here at Pacific Oaks. Diversity is just not about counting people, it's making sure that people count. Inclusion is really designed for us to include people in the decision-making process, and respect is having healthy conversations where you can, agree to disagree, because sometimes diversity, equity, and inclusion are really for people who see the world through a different perspective. We have to situate the pedagogy based on historical, socioeconomic, and political perspectives in order to really understand how to prepare educators to be ready day one. Here's something that we constantly like to do is invite people, persisting issues and an increased uncertainty. This is one of my favorite quotes from Louise Thurman Sparks, and it reads, "It's not sufficient to be non-biased and also highly unlikely, nor is it sufficient to be an observer. It is necessary for each individual to actively intervene to challenge and counter the personal and institutional behaviors that perpetuate oppression." It's so important that as we're preparing educators to be ready to go into classrooms, that they understand how to intervene, how to interrogate the curriculum, how to pivot the pedagogy when, students aren't hitting the mark, right? When we understand, the cultural assets that they bring into the community and into their classroom really is something for, educators to leverage day one. We definitely use a culture-centered approach. I do love the work of Peter Drucker. He would say, culture will eat strategy for breakfast. If you don't really address the culture, your strategies won't be as effective. We believe that educators should be reflective in their practice, fostering the teaching and learning, recognizing that each individual is unique. Educators foster unique talents in students, right? They have to be culturally competent, culturally intelligent, to really understand that, culture is something that students bring with them, right? And that is something that has to be valued in order to, expand their achievement. Another critical point here I'd like to underscore is being able to analyze theory and practice. It's important that educators are able to connect the two together, and valuing that we learn from one another, right? We definitely learn from each other, right? Your teaching practice is just as important as your teacher learning. As we look at our constructive approach to teaching, it's really, learning by doing. You're constructing learning experiences that really, we promote that critical thinking, problem solving, collaboration, and recognition of multiple perspectives. There's power in knowing what we don't know. So those multiple perspectives really help us build the confidence and competence to teach diverse student populations. A big part of the work with the intersection of culture and content and pedagogy is understanding that teaching and learning, there's a power dynamic that happens. And I wanted to underscore that, teaching is not a power trip, it's a partnership. We're not there to really lord that positional authority over the students. It's really a partnership. And we know that understanding the culture is the precursor to really connecting the pedagogical content knowledge that you need to serve those students. And when you understand it's not a power trip, but it's a partnership, you will develop and foster positive relationships. I really do believe, relationships need to be built before you engage in rigorous activities. You will definitely see an increase in student success and more family engagement. There's a way that we really have to ensure that families are engaging with us, right? We know that they're an important part of the learning process and us building capacity. When you engage in a cultural immersion experience during your teacher practice, it's a good opportunity to see students outside of the learning environment in their actual community, whether it's at a community center, whether it's an after-school program or an enrichment center, something along those lines. There's been a lot of work that has been done around the Triangle for Success. Doctors Caldwell and Parham talk about the ways of reconnecting the triangle between home, school, and community, because as we know, there is definitely a disconnect that persists through generations around homeschool and community. Often people at home and parents don't really know what their kids are learning because there's definitely a disconnect, right? So we have to find ways to reconnect that triangle. That triangle for success really is tied to preparation. I know, Michael Jordan is famous for a quote, and he says, preparation eliminates fear. And a part of the preparation is having us being able to reconnect this triangle so that homeschool and community have that level of coherence that really is centering the child, because we're all in it for student success. And the best way for us to really, amplify that or elevate their success is to reconnect the triangle. As we know, school culture has been a huge issue, but it's definitely something to understand. I know, Travis Bristow and his, fantastic scholarship talks about, students are, educator quality, teacher quality. They're not leaving their students or the families. They're leaving dysfunctional organizations and conditions that prevent them from being successful. So we really have to understand the importance of organizational theory, right? There's some triangulation here also with school culture when we talk about, achievement gaps and opportunity gaps, specifically for students of color. There's definitely something tied to school culture and poor learning outcomes. There's a positive relationship between teacher turnover and student underperformance, right? If they're in poor environments, most likely they're not going to stay. So a lot of the achievement is tied to strengthening the teacher pipeline and increasing educator diversity. We really do, I'm a big believer in understanding Maslow before Bloom. As we know, in the 40s and 50s, as we look at this hierarchy, the country was really in some challenging times where we specifically, Maslow had to list things like safety, your needs, food and shelter, right? Because this is really an important way to understand the basic needs first, right? It's relationship before rigor. But for some reason, I think in the last maybe 20 to 25 years, there's been something that's happening in, learning environments where, students have to achieve to belong instead of belong to achieve, right? Belonging has to happen first. You're coming to the environment, you belong in this environment, and then achievement will occur. If we continue to restructure this hierarchy, we start to see students, increase mental health, right? Increase school dropout rates, absenteeism, because we're shifting. Students have to belong to achieve instead of achieving to belong, right? That's so critical in understanding pedagogical content knowledge, situating in the culture. I just really love Herb Cole's work, and I had educators myself who kind of loved me into the life that I have that would share this. Kids don't care what you know until they know that you care. So that belonging and that caring environment is really the essential and foundational piece, and it really serves as a precursor to connecting the content with the pedagogy. I have to understand where the kids are coming from. I want to know, how they see the world. I want to value their cultural assets. Then I can begin this, subject matter competence. They will learn math, they will read once you understand where they come from and how they see the world and you value their assets. So again, it's understanding that with confidence, there comes competence. The other piece of, understanding inequalities, we have to really, underscore the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, and she talks about inequalities are never the result of a single distinct factor. Rather, they are outcomes of intersections, right? Her work is an intersectionality of different social locations, power relations, and experiences. If there is no name for a problem, we cannot see the problem. So as you know, her wonderfully coined phrase, say her name, as she was speaking about the brutality, and things that were happening with Breonna Taylor. It's important to understand that the intersectionality between culture, school achievement, and, educator preparation, when you think about, inequalities don't happen in a single distinct factor. There's definitely multiple reasons, right? And understanding that, inequalities exist in certain power relations, right? Like I said, I think the important part of, teachers understanding, it's not a power trip, it's a partnership. That relation will in fact change that experience. Here's some work that was happening. I had an opportunity to look at some of the clinical practice factors when you talk about preparing teachers to be ready day one. And we know, when the pandemic happened, kind of the world stopped. And I just have to really salute educators who were able to pivot and transition to remote learning in a matter of days to, really ensure that students had, the best quality education they could based on the circumstances. So here is something that was situated in the work. We were looking at the performance expectations, which are tied to the standards, right? When you look at performance expectations, they're tied to the standards and what teachers need to be able to do to teach in classrooms. There's a connection between your experiential learning when you're in practicum or you're in your student teaching. And they were doing that through different modalities. For part of it, they were in the traditional classroom in-person setting. And then when the pivot occurred, they were in distance learning. So some of the things that were impacting the pre-service teachers in clinical practice, what happens is their lack of cultural immersion experiences really changed their, relationships with students. So I think something that really came out of this is really being able to understand how do we incorporate those culturally immersion experiences in their experiential learning in the traditional classroom, as well as bringing it into the remote setting. So when we look at that, the first thing that happened is I wanted to make sure, if people are expected to teach, not teach to the screen, but teach through the screen, we had to make sure that they were ready. So, conducting an online readiness assessment too, I think it was really to make sure that, candidates were possessing the necessary skills to be successful in technology-rich learning environments. But what that reminded me of is something that Dewey said, and he talked about if the subject presented is totally strange, there is no basis upon which it may suggest anything serviceable for its comprehension, right? So, building on prior knowledge. So in order to really engage in technology-rich learning environments, we wanted to make sure that they had the prerequisites to engage in the work in distance learning. So it's important to really take those assessments and look at the data and let the data guide the decision-making. So that's a big part of matching the content with the pedagogy to be ready day one, is to understand, what's happening in your learning environment, what are the expectations, what is the organizational culture that I'm entering, right? Because I want to make sure that, if it's new to me, I have to know when to ask for help. Like I said, teachers, the teaching is just as important as teacher learning. So when you're unaware the comprehension's not there, we have to create that space so that when educators are ready day one, their pre-service programs are preparing them to make sure they have all the necessary tools to serve their communities well. One of the particular pieces of connecting, the pedagogical content knowledge is really looking at engaged pedagogy from, bell hooks. And we really were able to incorporate that pedagogy as, student empowerment, multiculturalism, right? Incorporation of passion, right? This is more of a calling, right? You really do have to, in the words of Warren Buffett, if you love what you do, you never work a day in your life. And I believe educators, it really is a calling that you have to really embody that with the passion. The engaged pedagogy is transgressive. It's a catalyst for learning and freedom, right? There's some liberatory practice that occurs when you're engaging students in this transformative process through holistic learning. Holistic learning does include their culture and their background, right? When you look at their beliefs, norms, language, histories, and symbols, that really is a holistic approach to the engaged pedagogy. The other piece that I want to underscore here is really understanding pedagogical content knowledge. It's a combination of content and pedagogy that is uniquely constructed by teachers, and thus the special form of an educator's professional knowing and understanding. When you learn something, the way you teach it is by that demonstration. So again, when educators learn something, they model it by that demonstration. That's a big part of owning the content, right? With confidence, there comes competence. Pedagogical knowledge is also known as craft knowledge, and Schulman really did a good job of underscoring these with respect to teaching practice, pedagogy, students, subject matter, and the curriculum, right? Being able to find the connections, right? You're collecting dots to connect dots. I know the culture, I know the student, I know the learning environment, I know the subject matter requirements, I know the standards, and that's how I can really create this pedagogical knowledge and become ready day one. It must be also, I want to underscore the third bullet point here. Pedagogical knowledge must be addressed within the context of the diverse pedagogy, right? Because pedagogy there's certain pedagogy for specific subjects or specific topics, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. But again, I think pedagogical content knowledge is in the diversity of pedagogy, because there's not one way to only teach. There's no one size fits all, right? We have to really base our teaching based on the needs of the learner, right? And that's equity, right? When you talk about equity and how that is situated in the space, it's a distribution of resources based on need. If a student needs differentiation, you give it. If a student needs acceleration, you give it based on need, right? So the how of developing the pedagogical content knowledge, it's really grounded in the work of the educators every day. It's not opposite of theoretical knowledge, right? I think it's deeply rooted in the experiences and assets of students, their families, and communities. So really to develop it, again, that culturally immersion experience is needed to really become ready day one. Some of the factors also will relate to the teacher's personal background, right? Because a lot of times your experiences are shaped based on your background. So we know that 80% of the profession are white middle-class women, and they may not represent the population that they teach. So we have to create those experiences so that they can become ready as well day one. We also looked at some frameworks around effective and equitable teaching. A lot of my colleagues were sharing this with me. And what we decided to do here is really look at the content. There's 5 key points to this framework for effective and equitable teaching. Content integration, right? You're using various examples from different groups and cultures. Knowledge construction, right? That's constructivist approach, which really is highlighted here in this equitable framework. You're looking at, some of your cultural assumptions, perspectives, and biases. It's important to really understand your own biases through that self-reflection. Prejudice reduction, absolutely, being an anti-racist teacher and understanding what that means and being anti-bias is really critical to being ready day one. You're implementing lessons and activities to assert positive images of ethnic groups and improve intergroup relations. Equitable pedagogy, you modify the techniques, right, based on student need. You facilitate academic achievement of students from diverse backgrounds. So I think what's important is when we really look at the effect of culture and equitable pedagogy, school experience and student success will be synonymously working together. And it really will empower the school culture, using the 4 dimensions to create a healthy, safe educational environment for all, right? We say that, and sometimes it's loosely interpreted, but again, the belonging is important. So if they can belong to achieve instead of achieve to belong, that's when you really create that healthy environment, creating a space for students to experience success and failure, right? I like students to fail forward. If you've been through an experience, the most important thing is that you learn from it. So again, that framework is important. And the other thing I'll keep repeating is teachers teaching is just as important as teacher learning, and that requires really bold leadership. And Michael Fullen and colleagues talk about what to do in terms of having that deep learning, right? Cultivating collaborative culture, focusing direction, purpose-driven inquiry, goals that impact, clarity of strategy, change leadership, accountability, right? There's reciprocal accountability. Educators are accountable to their students, and the students are accountable to their educators. Deep learning, right? That teacher learning. Precision in pedagogy, shifts practice through capacity building. And we talked about those two things with capacity building and precision in the pedagogy. Being able to connect the right pedagogy to the content to deepen the student's knowledge so that everything has that coherence and that alignment. And we all know, the great work of Gloria Lansing-Billings with being culturally responsive. So a big part of diving into the pedagogy is being culturally responsive. And these are 3 levels that, at some point we want, I think the ultimate goal here is to get to a level of critical consciousness. And that is kind of the highest level of being culturally responsive. The first part here I would like to underscore is teaching must yield academic success. That's definitely something. When you're there teaching, you want to be able to assess that students are learning and how are they learning and how do you know? Teaching must develop students, must help students develop positive ethnic and cultural identities while simultaneously helping them achieve academically. So again, their culture is so embedded with their success and their identity. It is really a linchpin to their academic achievement. And the highest level, which is, I think right now people would argue that we're still at, first base, we are at level 1, just teaching, yielding academic success. But I think theoretically, we want to get to a high level where teaching must support students' ability to recognize, understand, and critique the social inequalities. When they're able to see something and understand that it's wrong, and they're able to articulate it and speak up about it to really use their influence to impact change. So that's definitely something really important. Also bringing native language into the classroom, the history and culture, the community culture into the classroom, family involvement. When you see some of these pillars, there's just becoming a recurring theme, and the research is pretty clear on the importance of culture being at the center and also serving as a precursor to connecting pedagogical content knowledge. Culturally responsiveness in schools. Paul Gorski talks about, if students are experiencing racism, we can't wait for schools to move at their own pace and comfort level. At some point, there's definitely a shift that has to occur to really address some of those, unfortunate events, right? And I think that's important that in pre-service, we want to make sure that our educators are ready day one and they understand that, like we're not able to wait. But again, Gloria Lansing-Billings talks about developing a knowledge of the youth's culture, indicates a teacher's willingness to truly engage in the lives of students and take seriously what those students bring to the teaching learning experience. So it's so important to really be an effective listener as you're preparing to be ready day one to really connect the pedagogical content knowledge needed for you to be successful in the classroom, but really taking it seriously. And, we hear you, we see you, we love you. Those pillars are really important. I believe, classrooms and schools should be filled with, educators that believe all children can learn, right? All schools should be focused on justice, joy, genius, and love. And that's definitely something that's important. And as you're developing your cultural responsiveness, right? It's not a one-time event to be culturally relevant. It is a lifetime process, and it's not going to happen overnight. Being patient with yourself, giving yourself grace, as well as your students and your families, because I know on this journey, there are mistakes that will be made. And it's important to give yourself that grace and space to grapple with those mistakes that may come up, but also being, really critically reflective in your practice to really understand that you know, students and parents are sending their best and brightest regardless of how we perceive them. And I always share with candidates that I've never met an unsuccessful student. And if you can start to embody that, that really does change your perception on what's possible. When we talk about equity, I mean, there's several, and there's very many different definitions around equity. But specifically, when we're looking at connecting pedagogical content knowledge, addressing and correcting ethical, social, and environmental consequences of policies, ideologies, institutional and systemic structures, or actions on historically marginalized groups to ensure equal opportunities for all. I really thought this was important because that's a way to, for educators to really look at some of the academic policies, because there are policy drivers that can oftentimes prevent you from helping students maximize their potential, and interrogating the curriculum and some of the materials, being able to assess materials that you're using to discuss certain topics with your students is a part of being ready and being equitable day one as you move into your classrooms. The curriculum literacy, you have to be, curriculum literate as well as, equity. You have to have that equity literacy too, looking at the materials, ensuring the alignment, that's the connection, right? So there's, connection before correction, and we have to do that with the pedagogical content knowledge as well. Understanding the alignment with the resources, materials, standards, and expectations, as well as assessment. Finding a way to make sure that they're all articulated well really helps you develop the day one readiness. Critical reflection. I know that a lot of the work we've talked about today is really grounded in that reflection. When you talk about continuous improvement models, but it really does center around, critical reflection. You're drawing on some of the relationships, some of the areas where you need to reteach, some of the areas where you're trying to understand diversity, and, diversity is synonymous with excellence. I mean, there's a power and there's an equity that comes along with that. Teaching matters, as does the learning of teachers. And I'll keep saying that because I think that's so important as you're learning and doing at the same time. In leadership, you always stay in a position of learning, right? Because as we're starting to change, things are changing rapidly, and we have to pivot and adapt as these changes are occurring. Here's another piece of work that we've really looked at through our transformation center to increase educator diversity, but also looking at pedagogical content knowledge to prepare educators to be ready. We looked at one of our scholars in this work, Dr. Yvette Latunde, talked about this hospitality framework with our teacher educators, helping them engage with parents, having that safety and trust, the emotional space, intellectual space, spiritual space, and physical space to meet parents. Oftentimes, schools have a strict schedule, and we need to go out more into the community and really have that hospitality and grace when you're engaging with parents. Also seeking multiple perspectives. We really need to be explicit in structuring opportunities for students to hear varying perspectives. That's the power in collaboration. Sometimes it's important you see co-teaching models, or, you're partnering up with other folks to really dive in so that students can hear multiple perspectives. You can provide multiple perspectives without putting your own beliefs or political views on students. That's still anti-bias. At the end of the day, we want to teach our students how to think, not what to think. And having these frameworks in place really help you understand how to do that, regardless of your, political beliefs, but you teach who you are, and that's definitely something that shows up in the space, but we have to be mindful of that as we're shaping young minds. Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings talks about the poverty of culture, where culture is becoming the answer for everything, but it's also a default for underachievement and opportunity gaps. And that's not it, right? I think we have to be careful observers, connecting learning specifics of culture in various environments, understanding that power of culture shapes learning. The power of culture really does shape learning. When we understand where students are coming from, we have a better idea on how to get them to where they want to go. Again, the willingness to engage and take those students seriously. I wanted to underscore that again, because now we're to culturally relevant pedagogy 2.0, asking different questions, right? Like, what can we do to be more culturally aware? What does it look like to have a cultural immersion experience during your teacher preparation program? What is it like to do a course when you're reviewing curricular materials? Those are definitely things to start asking different questions. Why do we ignore culture so much, or why do we blame culture, and why do we blame the students' culture for their lack of student success in our classrooms? Those are some of the things that really are underscored when you're looking at asking different questions and advancing the work on culturally relevant pedagogy. And they require really deep conversations and safe spaces to really dive in, right? Because I know that culture is becoming a default. It's almost a buzzword, like equity, right? So we have to be careful, and I think we have to be mindful and figure out creative ways to articulate it so that it's not offensive, but it really gets us to the goal of improving learning outcomes for all children, regardless of their background. The other piece of the work that we looked at with our candidates and our faculty is Seeing with a Cultural Eye. Jackie J. Irvine really talks about teachers as cultural brokers. It's not enough to have, diverse teachers on campus as role models, but they're interpreters, right? They're interveners, right? They can speak to the culture in ways that people from that background don't, right? And I think that's so important, that sometimes, culture is a trait of the individual membership in a community. It's not a blanket way of one size fits all. Just because people are of the same background, culturally, they may have different traits. So we don't want to assume that, Asian American students learn one way and African American students learn another way and Latinos learn another way and white students learn another way. It's an individual way of looking at it. Seeing with the cultural eye, effectiveness and experience, I think, is schools have what she's describing here in this work is a lack of cultural synchronization, right? We just don't have the opportunities to really dive in. So again, I think the intersectional content here, as we've looked at with some of the briefings, it's definitely a perspective on teaching that really interrelates our beliefs, right? And I think there's something here when you look at a lens through intersectional content. Coherent, standards aligned curriculum literacy cultivates critical orientation. How do you critically orientate to the work, right? And that's through your cultural experience and your practice, right? Inviting multiple perspectives. So you start to see this scarlet thread that's weaving in, connecting the pedagogical content knowledge for educators to be ready day one. Here's some of the deeper work that was done when you're connecting the content to the standards to the pedagogy. So what I had an opportunity to do is look at our program learning outcomes in alignment with the teaching performance expectations and what specific pedagogical repertoire would help support candidates with this particular standard and to teach a particular subject. When you look at the very first one, the critical humility from Yolanda Silly Ruiz was a really great pedagogy to help students understand the comprehensible subject matter for teaching and learning of our diverse populations. So having that critical humility definitely is something there. It's valuing the students' cultural assets. When you're having healthy conversations and you're talking about real issues, we love the work of Chris Emden when we talk about the reality pedagogy. Some of the things that are happening in society do make their way into the classroom, and we have to be able to confront it. And the reality pedagogy is a really great tool to have that healthy learning environment and positive relationships, right? Being honest with the students, right? Trust is really important. Trust is really the currency of good teaching and learning, when you have trust between the educator and the student. As we know, not only do we want to be culturally relevant, but we want to sustain culturally sustaining pedagogy. Sami Halim and the scholar Django Paris really talked about sustaining that. So what happens when we sustain it is we're able to see it in assessment. At some point, my hope is that our pedagogical content knowledge and equity is similar to ADA, when we look at a ramp, we know that that is for someone who may need wheelchair assistance or unable to walk up a stairs. We should just know, equity, diversity, relevant pedagogy. We should just know it when we show up. And that's really definitely something I think we're leaning towards. And then again, culturally relevant pedagogy, looking at the tools, the technology across learning environments, right? Personalized and integrated, technology-rich, engaging student learning. When we look at some of the teaching performance expectations with our program learning outcomes, now we're being able to really see this synchronization of pedagogy, the content, and the teacher expectations based on their knowledge and their learning. And then the anti-bias pedagogy with Louise Durman Sparks, as we started with some of the quotes from her earlier today. Again, being able to teach difficult topics without pushing your personal views onto students. It's teaching them how to think, not what to think. Again, and some of the learnings that we've had is really understanding bias, right? Having that self-awareness of your own bias. Sometimes there's some discriminatory practices, understanding cultural diversity, right? Creating that internalized dialogue, framing and reframing one's thinking in order to improve upon learning is the basic to the active process of reflection. So that internalized dialogue addressing bias really does happen in reflection and holding honest conversations with your colleagues and creating those gracious spaces for you to be able to dive in and really talk about, the issues that matter. Equity literacy is another part of what we've found in some of this work to prepare teachers to be ready day one. We have to understand that, it's uncomfortable when people are in a position of bias or privilege, and that's where they are, right? So we have to really be able to unearth that. Although, racial identities inform cultural identities, race is not culture. And I think we really do have to separate that out because we know that, racial inequalities aren't predominantly cultural misunderstandings, because that's definitely important. And Paul Gorski does a fantastic job with this work in terms of having us separated out. Race is not culture. And what we have to do is when people are in a position of privilege and bias, it's hard to meet them where that's difficult because their position is going to be totally different, right? But we still have to find ways to have respectful disagreements. So again, our attitude, right? Do we look at bias before attitude, or we look at our biases and then we look at the affirming attitudes that educators need to have, right? Respecting cultural differences, using curricular and instructional practices related to cultures of their students, schools, and classrooms to be inclusive. So that attitude, the attitude of gratitude or attitude of respect, and also the attitude of partnership, right? Because we know that, teaching and learning is not a power trip, it's a partnership. And the attitude should be able to lean into that particular work and space so that their students will have that welcoming environment so that they can thrive. Positionality, that's important to look at, one's position. People come from various walks of life, right? Their positionality is definitely important to understand where they sit in terms of their commitments, their understanding, right? How their worldview is shaped, and that's all tied to their positionality. Socialization into their own group. Sometimes there's a group bias, right? Sometimes there's a man-made barrier between K-12 and higher education, right? And we need to really close that research and practice gap, right? So those are some of the things of positionality that we have to really grapple with so that, our practitioners as well as our researchers can really be in support of candidates going into schools to support, students and their communities. Again, that conflict theory is definitely something that we found in the work. Having, candidates really dive into what that is and how it presents itself, the self-serving bias, people claim more responsibility for successes than failures, reactive devaluation, rejecting a proposal based on who proposes it, right? Sometimes there's really good work from people who may not fundamentally agree with you, right? Those people were in the radical middle, right? They sometimes people will reject it based on, who proposes it, right? Good teaching is good teaching, regardless of the profile of the student. And there are many people from different walks of life who may have some really good strategies that work. At the end of the day, we're about student success. So I think finding ways to really look at conflict theory really helps us understand how it's situated and how it plays out. Cognitive dissonance, right? The mental stresses caused by holding competing beliefs. W.B. Du Bois talks about that double consciousness. There's competing beliefs, right? Because sometimes, Paul Gorski says, he teaches us that race isn't culture, right? That's totally different. Competing beliefs that students in poverty have a difficult time learning because of, it's their parents' fault, right? Those are some people have those beliefs and we have to grapple with it. Not always true, but again, we do have to grapple with those competing beliefs. And again, when you have healthy conversations or you have competing beliefs and you see differentiated responses, and we all know the January 6th and the George Floyd protests, and you see the differentiated response. And as you grapple with that, you ask educators to be ready day one. I think connecting the content pedagogy, the reality pedagogy would be really helpful in a case like this. You do have the right to petition the government, but you do not have the right to interfere with peaceful transfer of power. You do have the right to protest, but you do not have the right to destroy, community property. So again, you have to find ways to see differentiated responses, regardless of which side of the issues you're on. Those healthy disagreements really do help you talk about, some of the rationales behind objective truths, right? And I think that's definitely something that, as we see the narratives and how political education is becoming even more so now than probably 50 years ago. I mean, it's just, with some of the tragedies that occur, monthly, you're constantly looking at, disagreements, but at the end of the day, we're looking at, contributing to the public good, right? I think that's definitely something we want to, share with educators so that they're ready day one. Also looking at, the exchange of stories. It really helps you see the world differently. Like if I have a disagreement, I walk through the world differently than some of my colleagues. So sharing my story may shed light to other situations that they may encounter. As we know, my colleague and I had a publication and we talked about student motivation, but in a way having healthy dialogue circles, right? And this was really important to develop the confidence, family pride, self-awareness, express comfort and joy with human diversity, right? Demonstrate empowerment and the skills to act with others or alone against prejudice and discrimination. That's really important for educators because they're advocating for their students and the families that they serve, because ideally what we're trying to do is reconnect that triangle, and understanding the pedagogical content knowledge is a key piece to reconnecting the triangle between home, school, and community. We know the intersectionality of cultural responsiveness and DEI. Again, to have those dialogue circles, we looked at the courageous conversation framework, and Singleton really did share some great strategies on how to do that. To stay engaged, you experience discomfort, speak truth, expect and accept non-disclosure. And Dr. Tyrone Howard really talks about whenever you're in these really, healthy conversations that may, trigger certain feelings, you have to let the data lead the talk. Because we know this African proverb, until the lions have their historians, the tales of the hunt shall always glorify the hunter. So again, that data helps so that we have the counter narrative or the other part of the story. We know, Freire's work talks about the pedagogy of the oppressed. I really wanted, I saw this as a way of moving it towards hope. And I do believe hope is an acronym, holding on with patient expectations. And here what they're underscoring is that, engaging in dialogue is not necessary because we like the other person. We engage in dialogue because we recognize the social and individualistic characteristics of the process of knowing. This dialogue is kind of indispensable, right? I think it's something for us learning and knowing by having these healthy dialogues. And I know that really change really depends on us change doesn't look for a resting point, it looks for a launching pad. And I hope that being able to connect the pedagogical content knowledge and the intersectional content of culture, content, curriculum, families and communities really help educators be prepared as best as they can day one. And I'm done here. So I just want to say thank you all for listening, and then I can pass it back over to Kim for questions.
Dr. Hill, I know I was taking plenty of pictures of all of your slides. Thank you so much for sharing your content. For our viewers out there on the webinar, please use the Q&A if you have a question for Dr. Hill. As you're typing those up, I'll kick us off. Would love to hear a little bit of some of the impact that this has had in your setting, at your school, in doing this work with your teacher candidates. So just some bright spots that you've seen through adding this intersectional content into the work that y'all are doing at Pacific Oaks.
I've seen our students dive deeper into the research. In fact, we have some students presenting at the WASC Art Conference coming up at the end of April, I believe, this month. And they're talking about the importance of collaboration and course buddies. So that's definitely something we've done when you have a new candidate assessing their readiness. We've been partnering them with other peers that are further along in the program. So if you're a new student taking your foundations course, I'm putting you with a student in their first session of practicum, and that course buddies is really helping them really connect with the work. And I think mentorship is scholarship. I've seen our fieldwork supervisors and mentors really dive into understanding engaged pedagogy and understanding how to connect pedagogy to the specific topic. So they've been really open to sharing their voices from the field. I think I think policies have tried to push power down to the local level, and our candidates, mentor teachers, their school districts, there's just this radical collaboration that's happening that I really see that the candidates are benefiting. They really love social justice, and they understand what that means, and they understand it's about fairness. It's not about taking away from someone else, right? It's about speaking up for people who don't have a voice. And I think that's really some really bright spots to see candidates own the pedagogy, own their own learning, but also own their mistakes. When something happens, we talk about their professional dispositions around how to behave with your email etiquette or in-person etiquette. So we're starting to see that because, learning, when you have to give bad news if a student's not doing well, it does take a professional lens. You're not personalizing it, you're just being professional.
Thank you for sharing the bright spots that are happening on your campus. For folks who are starting this process, this journey, and they're just starting off, what advice would you give on where to start if this all feels like, yes, I'm in, but where to start?
I always want to start with your self-reflection and culture. I think I would start with culture. Culture is the precursor. Understanding cultural assets and needs based on the demographics that you're serving. If you're situated in a rural area, a rural culture is different than a suburban or a metropolitan culture. So understanding that context is really key, right? The other start is to give yourself grace, right? It's okay knowing what you don't know, and that's important, of acknowledging what you don't know. So those are really two start points I think I would share with people who are just starting out.
Dr. Hill, thank you so much for your time today, for sharing your experiences and for sharing around intersectional content. We just thank you so much for the knowledge that you're giving us that we can take away and include in our own practice. With that, I'm going to close us out in this last 5 minutes. During this series, if you see any of these principles in action, please use the Branchhead Framework hashtag, as well as the 6 principles hashtag, to share it with us on your social media. We can't wait to see how you're applying the framework in action. We also have our research brief which includes all of these principles in action, including Dr. Hill's work at Pacific Oaks, and you can find that on our resource portal. Our the last webinar of this series, our final nuts and bolts, is on May 3rd from 12 to 1 Central Time, 1 to 2 Eastern Time, where Branch Ed will highlight 2 unique tools that implement the framework 6 principles in powerful ways. You can register for it using the QR code that's on the screen or using the link in the chat. Lastly, we would love to hear about your experience today in this webinar by taking this brief poll. We just really want to thank you for your time and for being here today. And we thank Dr. Hill for his time and sharing with us. Y'all have a great rest of the week. Bye.